Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Harmful Algal Bloom webinar. And today we have two amazing guest speakers. Our first guest speaker is Yenna Quag, and she is a life scientist at EPA. Her work focuses on climate adaptation coordination in harmful algal blooms. In addition to her climate adaptation work, Yenna also collaborates closely with state agencies in Hawaii. And Yenna also received her bachelor's in environmental studies from University of Pittsburgh and her master's in land use and environmental planning from University of Pennsylvania. Our second guest speaker today is Katie Noonan. Katie is an environmental science educator, co-chair of the Rotary Nature Center Friends, and on the board of directors for the Lake Merritt Institute. Katie is a longtime steward of Lake Merritt and has deeply been involved in monitoring Lake Merritt's water quality. And so the two presentations today tell a great story of harmful algal blooms. So we're going to hold questions until the end. And with that, I can pass it off to Yenna. So thank you, Yenna.
Hi, thank you so much, Zoe, for that wonderful intro. And Zoe, can you hear the vehicles passing by from your audio?
I cannot. It's
okay,
just your
fantastic. Technology is amazing. Yeah, so I mean, I know this is a bit of a danger alarming warning sign, but I figure this is a good way to just get everyone's attention on how harmful algal blooms can get at their most extremes. And if you ever see one of these signs at a lake at your nearby park, you are not going to want to touch the water, swim, or fish here. Especially do not let your dogs swim in there or kids, because what I'm here to talk about today is that harmful algal blooms can be toxic and at times lethal as well. Not all harmful algal blooms are toxic, though. I want to be clear, but they can still cause overproductive algae and lead to mass die-offs that are unrelated to toxins. And that's something that I know Katie is going to talk a little bit more about later. Yeah, my goal for this presentation is to give you all a flavor of what harmful algal blooms are, and what types are specifically toxic, and how climate change sort of plays into this issue and impacts harmful algal blooms, and talk a little bit more about those sort of ripple effect impacts that harmful algal blooms can have. So at the most basic level, harmful algal blooms are rapid overgrowths of photosynthetic organisms in water. And as I kind of was alluding to, some harmful algal blooms can produce dangerous toxins in fresh or marine water, but even non-toxic blooms can hurt the environment and local economies too. And there are several different types of harmful algal blooms. So one, marine HABs. This, if you've taken AP environmental science, I remember learning about this version of HABs the most back in my high school days. But that red blob you see in the water is also what's known as a red tide. And this photo is from a red tide bloom that occurred offshore in San Diego back in 2022. And I think what's interesting to note here is that of the federal agency, NOAA is the one that leads marine HABs. And the next couple categories fall under EPA, which are freshwater HABs. So this photo here shows the overgrowth of standard algae, which, as you all know, algae is base of a food web. And at times it can be a nuisance, but other times it can become harmful and adversely impact the aquatic ecosystem by crowding out other species, depleting dissolved oxygen, and disrupting the ecology of the water system. Another example of non-toxic algae within the freshwater harmful algal bloom category is golden algae, and this is really common in especially Southern California and Arizona. And these affect organisms with gills and can cause massive fish kills, but it doesn't impact human health and pets as much as this last category, which will actually be a big focal point, Cyanobacteria or cyano harmful algal blooms. And these, in the past, and maybe a little less so lately, have been called blue-green algae due to the sort of bluish green-brown hue that it can give off when they're sort of in abundance. But this type of harmful algal bloom has the most severe impacts and have the greatest implications on human and animal health, as well as environmental health and other economic factors as well. This photo is from Clear Lake in Lake County, California. And these types of blooms are the ones that usually trigger the health advisories that you saw in my opening slide. So cyanobacteria is a big focus of EPA because a lot of freshwater HABs do have cyanobacteria. And so a big focus of my work, and therefore this presentation, is going to focus a lot on this type of cyanobacteria that produces this type of harmful algal bloom that causes or produces toxins. So cyanobacteria in its most basic form is over 3 billion years old, which is a fun fact. It's older than dinosaurs. And cyanobacteria, therefore, are really resistant and super persistent in nature. And it has this nickname of blue-green algae, as I mentioned before, because of its color. But interestingly, it's actually not algae, it's an aquatic bacteria. And the cyanobacteria can also look more reddish brown in color too, but this is the most known sort of color hue for this type of cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria still does have this ability to photosynthesize, and as you can tell from just the photos in the background, it can easily be mistaken as algae, and that's why it does get classified in this larger category that we call harmful algal blooms. So cyanobacteria isn't always bad. It's actually an important part of the food web. But when cyanobacteria becomes overproductive and produces toxins, it produces what we call cyanotoxins. And these toxins that are produced by some cyanobacteria. Those are the things that make cyano HABs for short potentially lethal. So the pictures on this slide, so of cyanoHABs, there's a lot of hierarchies I'm kind of walking through here, but of cyanoHABs, there's two types that you'll see in water bodies. The ones on the slide you see here are what we call planktonic cyanoHABs. These are the most obvious to detect, and as you can see, because they're visible throughout the water column. But there are other forms of cyanoHAB that aren't as obvious and sometimes aren't really visible. And that's what we call Benthicabs. So whereas planktonic cyanoHABs was apparent throughout the water column and made the whole water really murky, Benthicabs, they grow attached to the bottom of the water body. So the pictures on the left show a bit more of an obvious form of Benthicabs because they form these clear these mats on the ground, and the pieces can break off. And the one on the bottom right is a form of Benthicabs where the water is really clear and you can't always tell that that this is cyanobacteria. But I think that what's the most concerning about this type of HABs then is that it's harder to detect based on just a visual guide. This type can grow in clear water, it grows from the bottom, and these air bubbles can form and cause cyanobacteria to sort of break off into chunks and float up and break off. And a lot of times it's these floating detached mats that are the ones that dogs or kids, get their hands on or chew up and cause some health problems. So as I mentioned, cyanobacteria produces toxins. That's the main reason why cyanoHABs, I should say, can produce toxins. And there are also different types of toxins that cause different types of health concerns to the human body, especially. But also, well, this is in general, but I'm going to use the human body since we know human bodies best, right? So yeah, there are different cyanobacteria can produce different types of cyanotoxins that affect the different parts of organs. And so there's this one type called hepatotoxins, and this one can cause liver to die and fail and cause bile to release into the body. And this is a classic, this class is, it is a class of a chronic toxin. You'll hear microcystin. This is by far, I'd say, the most widely found cyanotoxin in freshwater harmful algal blooms. And there's over 100 plus types, and they work really slowly in our systems, but they are very toxic. Oh, yeah. Another type is cytotoxins. This causes damage to the kidneys. And cylindrospermopsin, that one's a mouthful, that is the most common type of cytotoxin that we tend to see in freshwater HABs. And there's also neurotoxins, which affect our nervous systems, and these ones are much more fast acting. There's a lot more research done on anatoxins, and saxitoxins are just a little bit more challenging to get good samplings for, but we do see both of those quite a bit in freshwater HABs. And dermatoxins, you know, that's your skin and your mucous membranes. It can cause different types of irritation when you're exposed to it. There are a lot of different ways that people get exposed to these. That can be direct contact from recreational activities, drinking water that's been contaminated with cyanotoxins, or even consuming fish that live in water that's contaminated with these cyanotoxins. So what are some of the causes of these toxic, harmful algal blooms? And frankly, a lot of these factors also apply to non-toxic ones as well. But in how, sorry, I'm just losing my train of thought here. Okay, so some of the factors that are conducive to the blooming of and the overproduction of cyanobacteria to make it harmful include warm temperatures, warm temperature water, and longer growing seasons. HABs typically occur during warm summer seasons, and when water temperatures are warmer than normal. CO2, so algae needs carbon dioxide to survive, and higher levels of carbon dioxide in the air and water can lead to rapid growth of algae, especially the blue-green cyanobacteria type that can float to the surface of the water. Nutrient-rich waters, especially abundance of phosphorus and nitrogen, are big factors that lead to overproduction of cyanobacteria, and this can come from urban and agricultural runoff, things like leaking septic systems, and other sorts of excess nutrients that can get into our water bodies. Slow-moving waters, so where water is slow and less turbulent, that's where cyanobacteria really thrives. And this is because water is not mixing or being disturbed as much. And so the slower and stagnant waters and low winds are conducive to harmful algal bloom growth. And a lot of reduced turbulence can also be, it can be natural, but some of it could also be man-made, where there are different altered or impaired water flows from things like dams, or as you know, with climate change, you know, drought. Summer, yeah, so increased inputs of nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, whether that's from fertilizers, human or animal waste, low water flows and stagnant water, the increased temperatures and durations of sunlight, can all create really ideal conditions for these types of blooms. But I think it's important to make clear that the presence of these drivers don't necessarily always mean that a harmful algal bloom will occur. But harmful algal blooms are really reliant on these types of conditions to really, for cyanobacteria and algae to kind of go into overdrive and then start causing more harmful impacts. So if you couldn't already tell from that initial diagram I shared, a lot of these things are being impacted by climate change. Climate change has been leading to stronger and more frequent algal blooms. So with climate change, a lot of these same drivers that allow algal blooms to thrive, they too are now on overdrive. And a lot of research, like a lot of the current research suggests that the change in environmental conditions caused by climate change are a catalyst for harmful algal bloom growth. In recent decades, scientists have observed an increase in not only the frequency of harmful algal blooms, but also the severity and a growing geographic distribution of harmful algal blooms worldwide in the US, California, in our backyards. So as researchers find that the impacts of climate change may promote the growth and dominance of these harmful algal blooms, yeah, it's just always important to be mindful of how climate change factors help us project and get a sense of what might be, you know, of how we need to prepare more for the future too, that this isn't going to be an easy solution to solve. So that's a little bit of like what leads to the cause of harmful algal blooms. And now I want to kind of walk through where they occur. Zooming out a little bit, these are some of the water bodies that you can find. And as I mentioned before, freshwater cyanobacteria, they bloom the most in quiet, still waters such as lakes and backwaters. But as I mentioned also earlier, they're super resilient. Cyanobacteria is super resilient, and they can still bloom in and be transported by really turbulent moving waters as well. And not only can they survive these moving waters, but they're really persistent and can survive in really a lot of conditions. They're super adaptable to a lot of environmental extremes, including light, temperature, moisture, salinity, oxygen, pollution, flowing and non-flowing water. And cyanobacteria have been found in all sorts of types of places, like so the water columns or the bottom of water bodies, like I mentioned, but they've also been found under ice, and they have been found to grow on rocks, plants, and shellfish as well. This now zooms out even more in a diagram to sort of show the watershed perspective. I am in the watershed section at the EPA here, so we always like to get this holistic perspective of how things work. So, you know, so far I've talked a lot about, if you can see my mouse, the center area where harmful algal blooms occur, but you can kind of see how upstream, you can see the wastewater effluent, urban water runoff, industrial effluent, how that can all come from further upstream and pool and contribute to the processes that that help create this environment for harmful algal blooms, and how that can travel further down into areas or source water areas where there are things like water treatment plants, or where we get our drinking water from. And what are the impacts? I actually feel like I spoke quite a bit about impacts already, but just to reiterate, there are a lot of wildlife and aquatic habitat implications. Harmful algal blooms, especially the toxic kinds that I've spoken a great deal about, they cause fish kills, and they can contaminate. And if they don't kill wildlife, can still contaminate fish, mussels, otters, and bioaccumulate. let's see, I think to speak more to the human exposure side as well. There's lots of ways that humans can get exposed, and sometimes it's from accidentally swallowing affected water, or even the aerosols sometimes from these water bodies can be a form of contact. Obviously, direct contact with skin can cause irritation, ingestion in our water, food, but the way that dogs and wildlife are especially susceptible to this because they're in the water and they eat things in the water. Children, especially for humans, are a higher risk just from their small body weight. They tend to spend more time in water and they have a lot more of that hand to mouth behavior. So that, therefore, you can probably imagine that has impacts on how we manage our drinking water. That affects recreation, like whether you're able to swim, jet ski, go fishing. And regards to fishing, there's a lot of cultural and economic factors that play into that as well, right? Like there are people who are reliant on fishing for their food. For a lot of people, it's their livelihood, for fishermen, for example. I thought it'd be helpful. I know I'm a little running a little low on time, so I'll try to be quick here. I don't want to do just a doom and gloom story. There's a lot of really incredible work that's going on at different levels. I will say it is, interestingly enough, there are no current federal standards for cyanobacteria or cyanotoxin levels. That's a process that takes a very, very long time. But in the meantime, a lot of federal agencies are doing really incredible work. And this is just really scratching the surface of what different agencies do to play a part in finding solutions for this problem. EPA has, all the federal agencies do a lot of research on the different aspects of harmful algal blooms. EPA has put out guidances for cyanotoxins, especially for recreational and drinking water, that a lot of states reference to help inform their process of setting up advisories to warn people of when water is considered a dangerous level versus not. USGS has a lot of guides on things like field sampling, because how you capture a water sample and test for different things is really important, and there's different methodologies for different types of algae and cyanobacteria. NOAA and NASA, they do a lot of really cool work on forecasting harmful algal blooms based off of all these, natural climate factors that we are already have data on, or have satellites. They do a lot of interesting work doing satellite monitoring and other forms of monitoring for harmful algal blooms as well. The CDC, their focus is on public health, and they provide a lot of guidance on the health implications for humans and for pets and other animals, but mostly the human side of things on the 4 different cyanotoxins. And that's a big, important educational aspect that helps people see the importance of addressing addressing harmful algal blooms. This is a really cool project that is a collaboration of all those agencies except for the CDC. So NASA, NOAA, USGS, and EPA, we all collaborated on a project that we called Cyanobacteria Assessment Network, or CYAN for short. And this is specifically for freshwater systems. And this is an early warning indicator for toxic and nuisance blooms using color satellites. So basically they have a satellite in space. They can pick up on different pigments and they're able to differentiate between certain types of harmful algal blooms, whether it's cyanobacteria versus not the non-toxic kinds. And it kind of gives a really big picture view of where these blooms are happening. And it's really great work. In California, I know, was one of the pilot states to really implement this into their state actions, which leads me to say, California, I believe everyone, if not most people, if not all here, live or from California, and you guys are living in a great state. California is a global leader when it comes to HAB actions. They're a leader when it comes to research, monitoring. They're one of the first states to really embrace the whole satellite monitoring technology that I just shared with you all. They put out a lot of guidance. They have a statewide incident response that's really focused and coordinated with other water boards. And they do a lot of work to do public communication and education, so people know the risks that they're that they might be exposed to. These are two programs or networks that I think kind of really lead the charge and bring everyone together that I thought is worth mentioning. There's the Freshwater and Estuarine HAB program, as well as the California Cyano-HAB network. They focus on the toxic cyanobacteria. The map that you see is that they regularly are pulling in all the reports that come in on cyano-HAB blooms that occur, and they put that on their website and just update it. And you can, I don't know if maybe you can share out the link, Zoe, or I can put it in the chat, but you can see where these blooms are happening, and they're updated very regularly. And the last action I thought I'd share is there are ways that you all can help in the reporting of these harmful algal blooms. There's a formal form that you can find with a bloom report for the state of California. And there's also an app called Bloom Watch, and that's organized and led by the Cyanobacteria Monitoring Collective. And this is meant to be a sort of citizen science approach for reporting on blooms, and also notifying your applicable state agencies on these blooms. And it's a little bit more user-friendly than kind of finding the right reporting link online. So I thought I will end there. I spoke a great deal about cyanobacteria, harmful algal blooms, and that is a big focus of EPA. And I just want to reinforce it's only one type of harmful algal bloom. And so I'm gonna let Katie take it away to talk more about this whole other world of other types of harmful algal blooms that that she is an expert on. So let's, I'm gonna unshare there. Thank you.
Hey, hello everybody. I'm going to, okay, so here I am. Hi. So my name is Katie Noonan, and I'm a retired teacher, a scientist, and I just love my local waterway that you see behind me, Lake Merritt in California. So let me share my screen. Okay. There.
Attack our reproductive rights and freedom, and I think we sent the message that lies, manipulation, voter suppression, the other side can try and use those as tactics to oppress us, but they don't work. We know our
There's some kind of background noise.
Our reproductive
Yeah,
rights.
Yeah, Katie, I think it's your the kind of example video that you're planning on showing.
I don't think so, but I can
The other side can try and use those as tactics to oppress us, but they don't work. We know our power, and we're going to keep.
Okay, I can just I'll turn that off entirely. Let's see if that gets rid of it. If it does,
Yeah, that's perfect.
All right, I have no idea what happened there. So thank you for pointing that out. Okay, so I'm Katie Noonan, and I'm a retired Oakland public school teacher at Oakland High School. I'm co-chair of Rotary Nature Center Friends, and also on the board of the Lake Merritt Institute, where I also edit the newsletter, The Tidings. So in this picture, we see a harmful algal bloom that occurred at Lake Merritt last summer. Rather a catastrophic event referred to as the lake having a heart attack. And It happened on August 28th, when people at Lake Merritt, which is in the center of the city, noticed on their morning walks that the shores of Lake Merritt were just covered with dead fish. And okay, so what possibly could have happened here? For people who are not familiar with the geography, Oakland, California is right on San Francisco Bay, and it's a little outpocketing of the bay into the first the Oakland estuary, and then up into a 130 some acre lake in the middle of the downtown area. So Lake Merritt is a tidal estuary, meaning that water comes in from the bay and goes out twice a day with the tides. Lake Merritt also receives water from several creeks and tributaries in the Oakland Hills, as well as San Francisco Bay. So it's often as salty as seawater when we're in a drought period, and in the late summer and fall. It's often been saltier than the ocean. But as we have had experienced in the last few weeks, after winter storms, it can be almost as fresh as drinking water. And that's a condition that prevails right now. This can be a challenge for the community of living things that makes up the estuary. So an estuary is a kind of enclosed area where fresh water, the land, and salt water from the ocean mix. Lake Merritt was established in the as a colonized area by people from the United States, largely in the 1800s, especially increasing around the time of the gold rush. And here we see on the left a map of the Lake Merritt area in 1857. And I tried to have these two slides oriented so that the arrows would kind of point in the same direction. And what's really strikingly different now is that the channel that leads from the lake to the bay is much narrower than it used to be. Lake Merritt used to be a mudflat for a lot of the time, surrounded by marshes and wetlands, creeks, but not the hardened city landscape that we see in this picture. So in 2008, Lake Merritt was declared an impaired body of water by the Environmental Protection Agency, largely because of floating trash that came in through the storm drains from the city streets, and also low dissolved oxygen coming in from the runoff from the city that contains nutrients, as we'll see how that can contribute to low oxygen. I want to thank Yenna for her clear and beautiful explanation of all the different kinds of harmful algal blooms that occur in freshwater and some in saltwater as well. Lake Merritt has the dubious distinction of having seen all of those that she listed over the course of the last year, and has been increasingly under study by many people. But the real kickoff event was in August of 2022, when people noticed a very large slick of algae in the San Francisco Bay. And you can see it was out in the bay, going off the Alameda, the bay side of Alameda, and heading underneath the Bay Bridge past the island of Alameda. They now have an idea where that started, which was on the bay side of Alameda. But very soon, that algae was headed for Lake Merritt. And on the left, you see a picture of the Lake Merritt Channel. And it's the kind of chocolate colored water is water that is filled with harmful algae. And on the right, we see what happened when it arrived at the lake. We can see in the little inset that there's some clear water and then some chocolate colored water. And then at the very northeast tip of the lake, where there's a barrier here for trash, you can see that on the bay side of that, we have chocolate water. On the inland side, less so. So when a when a plankton populations just suddenly explodes, and it's called a plankton bloom. And this happens when we have certain types of bacteria, certain types of algae that find the conditions especially conducive to their growth and competition with other kinds of species in the water. So they're able to just explode and take over. I'll show you some pictures of what microscopically in a short while. But before we go much further, it's important to talk about harmful algae and what they are. So they are marine plankton, but they're not actually related to the green algae that you may think of when you think of algae, like kelp and sea lettuce and all that. They're not related to that very closely. I'll show you a phylogenetic tree in just a minute. They're in the protist kingdom, which means kind of a very diverse group of clade of organisms, and so they're very diverse. But they are they're good in a sense that we would have a hard time living without our plankton. Phytoplankton, that is photosynthesizing plant-like plankton, are at the very base of the marine food web, and they produce 50 to 80% of the oxygen in our atmosphere. So we have to give them credit for being essential players in the marine ecosystem. Okay, so on August 28th, there was a massive fish kill, not only in Lake Merritt, but in the whole East Bay and running up into the North Bay a little bit, down into the South Bay, but not all the way to the bottom of the South Bay. We found mussels dying everywhere. And from this photo or this map from iNaturalist, you can see that there were many locations where dead fish were appearing at Lake Merritt. There were 39 plus bat rays, beautiful, large elasmobranchs that used to come into the lake and swim together in tandem. You know, it's kind of a courtship thing. They were just beautiful. There were 522 striped bass looking like this, or gasping for air, and thousands, tens of thousands of small fish that just just washed up dead on the shore. So how is it that the harmful algal bloom leads to fish kills? There are a couple of ways. The first way that we often think of are toxins, and I know and Yenna mentioned the specific toxins that different types of cyanobacteria will release. And excuse me. So these toxins could be produced by our harmful alga, and that could have a direct effect on fish or some certain organisms. By the time the fish kill occurred, it wasn't just the fish, it was everything that was dying. And that was because there was a loss of dissolved oxygen. So it could be both, but at the time of the very famous and public fish kill, there was 0 oxygen in the water. And the way this can occur is that algae cells that are photosynthetic and produce oxygen through photosynthesis during the day must consume oxygen like all living things at nighttime. So they're drawing oxygen out of the water at night, leading to nighttime low oxygen, which if you can call it anoxic if there's no oxygen. When the algal cells die off and bacteria and other organisms are around, they will consume them in the decomposer web. But the decomposers also use use oxygen for cellular respiration, and that means that we have a further loss of oxygen in the water. In a short time after the appearance of the big slick of algae, scientists were able to identify the kind of algae that was causing the bloom. And this was a organism that is in a side branch of the excuse me, it's a side branch of dinoflagellates. It's not a dinoflagellate, but it's closely related. And many dinoflagellates have a really hard shell on them. They're called armored, but this one does not have a hard shell, but it's very adaptable because it's what's called mixotrophic. It can both be a predator and a photosynthesizer. And this allows it to hang into the system later than many other kinds of plankton can, because when there's not enough light for photosynthesis or not enough nutrients needed, they can eat other organisms. They are also not known to have any specific toxin, not to humans, but we can't be sure. So we should always assume that we should be extremely cautious when we have these blooms. Another thing to point out is that these are very numerous microorganisms, and they can evolve quickly in response to environmental changes, novel environmental changes. So what is typically seen with the kind of alga that caused the fish die-off, called Heterosigma akachiwo, what's typically found is it sneaks in after a big bloom of larger phytoplankton called diatoms, and they are able to survive in minimal environments, and then they just take off and explode until they run out of nutrients, and then they will again die, get decomposed, and that too creates zero oxygen. So I'd like to show you a chart that was made right after the big fish kill, and some kids and some local citizen scientists who went out to test the water after the fish kill. And they found that during the right at the time of the fish kill on August 28th and 29th, there was zero oxygen in the water, either top of the water column or the bottom. And that condition hung on for about 6 days, 6 days of zero oxygen. We're probably not over the effects of that, but we were able to gather information with the help of high school students and also community volunteers, as you see in the lower right, going out with a professional instrument sonde to test the water oxygen and other factors. And if we step back and we look at the oxygen in the water, top and bottom, we'll see a pattern here that's quite striking. Usually we have a higher oxygen in the top, lower oxygen in the bottom. And we almost never have an oxygen level lower than the EPA minimum level, which is 5 parts per million, indicated by the dashed line. Almost never do you see a light blue line below that, except when we hit August 28, it just crashed and it stayed there for 6 days. So this was a unique situation in the year 2022. It's also pretty unique in the history of Lake Merritt as far as it's been observed over the last several decades. So unique situation, and it seems it's very important to understand why it happened with this organism at this time. And as Yana alluded to, we are experiencing the effects of climate change. Could they be involved? There are a lot of questions here that we don't know the answers to. And so as a case study, I think Lake Merritt is just so important to try to understand how this harmful algal bloom happened and how it is, what caused it, and so forth. So what is it that encourages this organism Heterosigma cashew to bloom. It turns out that it likes warm water temperatures and high salinity, exactly what we were seeing throughout the year in 2022, because there's a drought, had been hardly any rain for a year and a half. Low phosphorus and other nutrients. Well, we didn't know that, but people are very interested in what nutrients are coming into the lake and how the metabolism of the lake works in relation to these nutrients. Then there could be a depletion of the competing diatoms. So the diatoms somehow disappeared for some reason, and that allowed the Heterosigma cashew to explode in minimal conditions. And the fourth condition is stratification of the water column. Strata means layers, and in a water body, you can have layers of water, either different because they're different salinity or different temperature or a variety of factors. And in an estuary, it's quite frequently different salinities. And because there are two different distinct layers, mixing from the top to the bottom tends not to happen. It's inhibited, and that can lead to organisms using up all the oxygen in the lower level and being prevented from getting oxygen from the air in the upper level and from oxygen from photosynthesizing organisms. The thing is, we were not seeing a lot of stratification in 2022 in August. Another factor which Yenna also mentioned is increasing sunlight. And this was some factor that was mentioned by scientists in discussing the bloom. So here we are, and I know I'm running late too, oh my gosh. But I do want to show you something here. This is a picture of the actual organism. And this is a bloom whose toxicity is related to temperature and salinity. That's another thing we don't understand. Many of these organisms can turn on and turn off the amount of toxins that they produce depending on the situation. And it would be so helpful to understand that. We do know that climate change is bringing about changes in our water that could lead to these problems. So one of the things that we do, I do as a group leader of citizen science and science education, is to go out and take plankton tows. So we not only get water quality, we get plankton tows. I'm going to try to show you just what it looked like in the plankton on that day, on those days in August when we had the plankton bloom. So hopefully this is going to work. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so here we go. We're going to go here, and what I'm going to do is what we're going to do here is all right. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share. Try again.
We're going to teach to attack our reproductive rights and freedom. And I think we sent a message that lies, manipulation, voter suppression, the other side can try and use those as tactics to oppress us, but they don't work.
And what I'd like you to notice about that clip. I'm going to stop the thing clip here. Just a second. Yes. What I'd like you to notice is that there's only one kind of cell kind of tumbling around. We used to call this the tumbling snowflake, but it was going to be, but it was, let's see, yeah. Okay, so now you're seeing my whole setup. So try one last time. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. What I liked especially was a comment by one of the scientists that follows plankton in the bay, Jim Irvin, and he said, understanding this organism is one of the most important things that we can do, and we don't have much time because we're going to be facing another summer with potentially more extreme conditions. So we need to understand. And so the tragic events taught us that we really need to understand more about water quality and about the plankton in our lake. Just like to point out, here we have the dinoflagellates here. Here we have the diatoms and some of the other kinds of some of the other kinds of plankton that you might see. And since that day, we have seen no fewer than 3, actually a lot more than 3 plankton blooms in Lake Merritt. And you see on the left, one of the things I do is I bring students out to the lake and we take plankton tows and water quality at the same time. And we send it off to the Department of Public Health. They'll come back to us and give us their analysis of the species that we are seeing. And at this particular time, the blooming species was something called the Lasiosira. And so we collected some of that. It's continuing to bloom. It's there today. And we're lucky enough to have the help of Janai Southworth from the National Marine Sanctuaries to take a sample of it that we collected and take it into a scanning electron microscope lab. And you can see we have these spiky circles here corresponding to these links in the Lasiosira. And then we have these little dot things, and those correspond to these long little things. It's another kind of phytoplankton called skeletonema. So since what we've been seeing now is, which is kind of fascinating, is we're seeing very high oxygen levels in the lake since the kill. We have been seeing extremely high levels. You can actually go in and look at what the oxygen levels are in Lake Merritt, thanks to the good work of the Lake Merritt Institute and the City of Oakland. They put out monitoring buoys. You can see the little buoy there. You can also see some of my volunteers coming out to test the water with a handheld sonde, and we get remarkably similar results. So that's great. My group has been following oxygen since the plankton bloom, really. And these maps, we're going to start here. You see right after the bloom, we see only the black squares in all these different places, indicating 0 oxygen top and bottom. As we moved into October, early October, we see that oxygen is pretty good. That's the green stack here, green, green, green. Here we had good oxygen at the top and low oxygen at the bottom. And we see a little low here, but then it got better. The little graph here tells us that during this time that we had the low oxygens, we were also having closures of the tide gates, preventing mixing. So as Yenna was saying, we had slow moving water, just right for the conditions for harmful algal blooms to take off. And so we just been following it, and we're seeing that as of the 11th, which is the latest one I've shown you here, quite frequently, we have really good oxygen. So what would be the long-term effects? Long-term effects are loss of parts of the estuary food web, acting synergistically in a bad way with seasonal changes in salinity and natural climate cycles. It's natural for the climate to vary, but because of the impact of that kill, there's less resilience in the community. Many species had returned by late October from the fish kill, but others are still not there or in very reduced populations. So this signals that we're vulnerable to anthropogenic climate change. So what actions can be taken? Well, yeah, I'm going to skip over a few things one of the things that we did is to monitor the species present in the lake. And so we went out to see 2 months after the fish kill, how many species had come back. And it was quite amazing. A lot of them had come back. 145 species of the fish, lots of fish had come back by that time, including some baby fish, which was great, indicating reproduction going on. One thing we saw, which was really bizarre, was there was what we called a nudibranch boomtown. We had like 10 species or more of nudibranchs. These are the things you see on David Attenborough usually, including species that had never been seen this far north and a species that had not been described before, all in Lake Merritt. So possibly we had such a disruption of the food webs that these organisms, predators, were not around, and they were able to move right in and take up home. But now we've had our atmospheric river, and the water is so fresh, there are no more of those beautiful nudibranchs at the lake. So what can we do? We can monitor water quality and learn more about the resident species and how they interact with the physical environment. We can keep up our guard on invasives, even microorganisms like plankton. It's possible that this harmful algal bloom was a variety that came in from somewhere else. We can reduce our urban runoff and introduction of nitrogen fertilizers into the waterways. Improve in aeration and oxygenation in the lake. And the Lake Merritt Institute and the City of Oakland are putting together a plan and raising funds in order to be able to do that. So in case we do have another bloom, we can provide oxygen in the lake and prevent the massive fish die-off. And we can also realize that this is a global problem. We need to support efforts to adapt equitably to the global climate change, and also to reducing our emissions that cause global warming. Okay, so I want to thank you, and I'm almost done, but not quite. There's an opportunity for you to participate in a City Nature Challenge Bio Blitz on April 30th if you're in the area of Lake Merritt. If not, you can go to iNaturalist and you can find a place near you where you can use your iPhone to document biodiversity right near your home. And this is this will be hugely helpful at Lake Merritt to see what is coming back after a double whammy of the fish kill and the atmospheric river. And finally, I want to make sure everybody knows about a free online Zoom that's coming up on Friday the 14th at 7 to 8 p.m. And I'll put this in the chat as well as here. I'm hoping that you all recognize Alfred Russel Wallace as the co-discoverer of the theory of evolution by natural selection. And his biographer has a fascinating story to tell you about his ideas and contributions and his passion for social justice. It's really good for our times. So I want to thank you all, and I'm going to stop sharing now. And thank you for your interest in HABs.
All right, thank you so much, Katie and Yenna, for your presentations. I just wanted to check and see, do we have any questions right now from the audience? Yeah, Carter.
Hi, thank you. So I understand like a lot of what we were talking about was like the science of the HABs, what makes them. Also, with Ms. Noonan was talking about how to prevent them, but what if it's actually in progress? What can we do then?
Good question. There wasn't much that could be done. And so, I mean, that's in the realm of we don't know. And that's why all this background research in the Bay with the San Francisco Estuary Institute, with the EPA, is so important. We need to understand the metabolism of the Bay and Lake Merritt. So the Lake Merritt Institute and the city are proposing increased aeration devices in the lake. and also possible direct injection of oxygen in the case of an emergency. No guarantee that that would actually really help a lot, but it's might be better than nothing. And we could have another event as early as this summer.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I think I'll also add, if you recall the diagram I shared that shows a sort of watershed perspective of all the different factors that can contribute to this. There are a lot of different. It's like a larger. Yeah, there's a lot that's unknown, and that's why there's research that's needed. But for us to prevent HABs, it requires like a full court press on like a lot of different other factors that play into water quality in general. And even within the EPA, just as the HABs coordinator, I've been having to keep in touch with folks who do things like the standards section, people who set the water standards. There's the folks who do the non-point source program projects. There's folks from like the tribal water, there's drinking water elements to this. How do you equip people before a bloom happens to minimize any of the negative consequences that can come when these go into sort of like hyper bloom mode? It's not a really easy, concise answer, but there's a lot happening in this picture. I hope that helps.
Pavita?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, my question is, with the scenario for our students to problem solve, our theme is adapting to a changing climate. My first part of the question is, what are your views about how can we adapt or mitigate the impacts of these harmful toxic algae blooms? And my second part is it rather more of a regulatory approach for prevention and control, such as through discharge permits from sewage treatment plants or through stormwater permits that the local regional board has to impose on cities to control these kind of discharges and runoff issues that contribute?
So yeah, I mean, goodness, from an adaptation standpoint, I mean, there's also, I think, yes, regulatory, I think the regulatory process just takes such a long time, and I kind of alluded to that. But I know like this, setting standards and monitoring and setting baselines is one way. I think one of the biggest challenges with some of the, even for states and local partners that I've heard quite a bit from, is one of the challenges is just the capacity to even be monitoring the water to know which water bodies are the most at risk to prioritize, because it's really hard to keep tabs on everything. So I know there's a lot of monitoring efforts and coordination efforts because of that. I know from the non-point source perspective, you mentioned like the stormwater permits. Goodness, yeah, like there's so much that comes from our urban water runoff. There's also the ag component as well, that there's a lot of different strategies for non-point source pollution around those already that directly relate to adaptation as well. And then I also want to talk about water flow is another aspect of climate change impacts, but also things like a lot of projects like dams or other projects that can affect flow also can cause or just lead to environments that are conducive to HABs. So I think when we're thinking about climate adaptation, a lot of infrastructure too, there are all these other, there's that flow factor as well that can come with infrastructure. And I feel like I'm not really organized in my thoughts responding there, but I figured that I'd give those initial sort of like word vomit of thoughts.
Those are all important things. I think, from my perspective in Oakland and at Lake Merritt, we've been, the Lake Merritt Institute actually, its mission is to reduce trash and low oxygen in order to meet the requirements of the permit. And I I feel like my short answer to the question that Jovita asked is that we really need to involve everybody in education and concern and involvement. So the Lake Merritt Institute has people come out and help take trash out of the lake. Rotary Nature Center Friends has a series of online lectures and interactive lectures, and we bring students out to do stewardship. And I think this is you can't just deal with one part of it without seeing the impact of all the other parts of it. And in order for people to be willing to make some difficult choices, and to, like, the city of Oakland is, very stressed economically, but they're having to make some decisions about what to do about their response to this fish kill, and also to sea level rise, and flooding, and all these climate related impacts. So I think, rather than only to inform people, but we also need to involve them in understanding and finding out and helping. And it won't solve anything immediately, but it will help people develop the capacity to think in global terms and regional terms that are going to be required to adapt and to respond. So that's, I think, education.
I think that's great. Your answers are both great. I mean, it really is, as Yana mentioned, it really means taking a holistic and integrated approach to protecting Lake Merritt and our other waters. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add one more thought to Katie's point about, participation and the education piece. When it comes to like climate justice, I know I just really want to make sure I highlight also the impact that harmful algal blooms have on tribal nations and their reliance on subsistence fishing, and how, if these blooms are killing fish or leading to toxins in the water intake, or in the fish that, that they eat or rely on, that's a big implication that I feel like I should be mentioned very explicitly here too, and especially relevant in California.
Yeah. Water justice is a big issue, and really puts people into the larger picture of the whole world ecosystem that we're impacting so strongly.
Absolutely. What we focus on in California Envirothon are our indigenous peoples and our disadvantaged communities and the vulnerable communities throughout our state as we address each kind of current issue theme. And definitely tribal nations are part of our scenario this year as well. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other raised hands at the moment, but I will definitely thank you again, Katie and Yenna, for taking the time out of your Saturday to present. And I've really appreciated all of the hard work and effort that you've put into your slideshow presentations. I would definitely encourage all the students to check out the nature talks that Katie helps organize, as well as explore the resources that Yenna and Katie have provided in their slideshow in regards to harmful algal blooms. And yeah, I think we can close out this webinar, but again, thank you so much, you guys, and have a great rest of your Saturday and weekend.
I second that. Thank you very much.
Thank
And
you so
thank
much.
you, Zoe. Take care.
So much, Zoe.